My dear child, I am standing at your doorstep right now, with my hand extended across your threshold, and the only thing between you and what I am holding is the single responding movement your hand has not yet made. Do not scroll past this. What I am about to reveal is not about patience or waiting or trusting God's timing. This is about a knock that already happened, a door that already has someone standing on the other side of it, a hand that is already extended, fully, completely, everything on my side of the gesture finished, waiting for the one movement that completes an exchange. Your faithfulness has been preparing for, but your passivity has been preventing from closing. The knock already came, my hand is already out, and the gift is already in it. You have been waiting for me to move. I need you to hear what I am about to say with the full weight of its specificity. I already moved. I crossed the distance. I arrived at the door. I knocked. I extended the hand that carries what you have been praying for. Every action on my side of the threshold has been completed. Not in the future, not in the process of being arranged, but completed. Finished. Done. My beloved child, the exchange is a two-sided gesture. One side extends, the other side reaches back, and the extending has been finished for longer than you realize. What remains is not more waiting, not more prayer for the thing to arrive, not more faith that the thing is coming. What remains is the single, simple, available movement of your hand reaching toward a hand that is already there. I am not asking you to manufacture the gift. I am asking you to take it. Stay here. What I reveal next is how long my hand has been extended, and what your waiting has been preventing from completing. Type hand extended if God is standing at your threshold right now with a hand already extended, and the only thing preventing the exchange from completing is the responding movement your hand has not yet made, because your waiting crossed from trust into a passivity that does not realize the knock already came. Before we go any further, I need to tell you something that genuinely surprised me. A neuroscientist discovered a simple 7-second technique that actually rewires how your brain processes thoughts. And when I tried it, the difference was almost unsettling. My focus sharpened, ideas started connecting faster, and that mental fog gone. This isn't manifestation nonsense. It's backed by real brain science, and thousands of people are already seeing results. But here's the catch. Only 5 spots are left. If something inside you is saying, try it, trust that instinct, click the link in the description or pinned comment before it's too late. The hand has been extended across your threshold for longer than you have been praying for the thing it holds, because the extension preceded the prayer. My beloved child, I need you to feel the weight of the timeline. You prayed for something specific. The prayer was genuine, the faith was real, and the request entered the system with the full weight of a heart that believed the asking would eventually produce the arriving. But the arriving did not wait for the asking. The hand was extended before the prayer was spoken. The gift was at the threshold before the request was formed. And the prayer, the earnest, faithful, sincere prayer you have been sustaining across this season of waiting, was spoken to a God who was already standing at the door, holding the very thing the prayer was asking for. You were praying for what was already there, and the praying became a substitute for the reaching. My dear one, the substitution is the core of what tonight must address. Prayer and response are not the same movement. Prayer is the communication between the person inside the house and the God outside the door. Response is the physical movement of the hand toward the hand that is waiting. And a person who sustains the prayer without making the response is a person who is communicating with the giver about the gift, while the gift is being held out across the threshold by a hand that is waiting for the communication to become a clasp. The communication must become a clasp, and the clasp requires movement your prayer does not produce. This message was not released for everyone who is waiting on God. This was aimed at the one person whose specific waiting has crossed the line from active trust into the specific, faithful, theologically justified paralysis of someone who believes the correct posture before God is stillness, and who does not realize that the God standing at their threshold is not asking for more stillness, but for the one movement that converts the waiting into receiving. Type clasp prayer. If you just realized you have been praying about what is already at the threshold, and the prayer became a substitute for the reaching, because the posture of faithful waiting crossed into a paralysis that does not recognize the knock already happened, and the hand is already extended, and the only missing movement is yours. I have been standing at your threshold with my hand extended, watching you pray about the very thing I am holding. And the watching has been the specific tenderness of a giver whose hand is full and whose recipient is sincere, and whose only obstacle is the distance between the prayer and the reach. My dear one, not from across the street, not from a position where the distance between the giver and the receiver is still being traveled. From the doorstep, inches from the door, hand extended across the threshold. Close enough that the warmth of my hand is detectable on the other side of the door, if the person inside pauses their prayer long enough to feel the air. I have been that close, for that long, and you have been praying to a God you believed was still approaching. My beloved child, I watched the specific moments when your prayer came closest to becoming a reach. There were instances, brief, almost involuntary, where something in you shifted from the posture of asking to the posture of moving. A stirring, a leaning toward the door that lasted half a second before the theology of waiting pulled you back to the center of the room where the praying was happening. The leaning was the correct instinct. The pulling back was the learned one. I chose you for this message because the frequency of the leanings has been increasing, meaning the part of you that senses my presence at the threshold is growing stronger than the part of you that believes the correct response to my presence is continued stillness. The leanings are your spirit detecting the extended hand, and the spirit's detection is trying to override the theology that says responding to detection is presumption. My child, responding to a knock is not presumption. Responding to a knock is the only appropriate response to a God who traveled the full distance and is standing at the door, waiting for the distance to be closed from the other side. Type leaning toward if God has been standing at the threshold, watching you pray about what his extended hand already holds, and the brief moments where your posture shifted from asking to moving were the correct instinct being overridden by a theology of waiting that classified the leaning as presumption rather than response. I know what the waiting has been doing to the specific part of you that connects your faith to your expectation of results. My beloved child, the waiting was supposed to feel holy. In the beginning it did. The first season of waiting carried the sacred texture of a person who trusts the timing of a God, whose movements cannot be rushed, and whose arrival cannot be forced. The waiting felt like worship, like the highest expression of a faith that believes without seeing and trusts without demanding, and holds the posture of receptivity without the anxiety of forcing the outcome. The waiting felt like worship until the worship started producing exhaustion. My child, I watched the exhaustion enter the worship without announcement. The way fatigue enters a posture that has been held too long, not through a dramatic collapse, but through the slow degradation of the muscles that maintain the position. The spiritual muscles that sustain faithful waiting are real muscles. They fatigue, they thin, and muscles that hold a posture past the point where the posture was supposed to transition into action begin producing the specific worship-level exhaustion of a person whose faith is being consumed by the posture their faith is holding. The posture was consuming the faith that was holding it. I watched the consumption produce a specific wound at the intersection of your faith and your expectation. The wound says, I have been faithful, and the faithfulness has not produced what the faithfulness was aimed at. The wound does not question God. It questions the connection between the person's obedience and the person's outcome. And a wound at that intersection is the most dangerous wound a faith can carry, because it disconnects the believer from the belief that their posture before God has any bearing on what God does in their life. You are not questioning me. You are questioning whether your faithfulness is connected to anything that is actually moving toward you. And the hand at the threshold is the answer the questioning has been begging for. The deepest wound the waiting inflicted was not the duration itself. It was the gradual, devastating suspicion that the door you were waiting behind might not have anyone on the other side of it. My dear child, the suspicion did not arrive as a theological crisis. It arrived as a feeling. The specific body level beneath the faith feeling that the door you were oriented toward, the door you believed someone was approaching, the door your prayers were aimed at, the door your entire posture of waiting was organized around, might simply be a door with nothing on the other side. Not a rejection, worse, an absence, the possibility that no one was coming. My beloved child, I watched the suspicion settle into the posture the way moisture settles into wood, invisibly, gradually, warping the structure from the inside without producing visible damage on the surface. Your posture of waiting looked the same from the outside. The prayers continued. The orientation toward the door remained. The language of faith stayed intact, but the wood of the posture was warping. The warping was the suspicion converting the waiting from active trust into something closer to ritual. You continued the posture because the posture was all you knew to do. Not because the posture was producing the connection it once produced between your heart and the God you were waiting for. The connection had thinned. Not broken, thinned. The way a signal thins when the distance between the sender and the receiver appears to increase despite neither party moving. My dear one, the distance did not increase. The door was between us, and the door that you were waiting behind, while I was standing in front of, was producing the illusion of distance because the door was closed. A closed door between two people who are inches apart creates the experience of infinite distance for the one who cannot see through it. The distance was the door, not the God behind it. Type door between us if the waiting produced the suspicion that no one was on the other side. And the infinite distance you felt was not a God who was far but a closed door, creating the illusion of absence between a person praying inside and a God standing outside with an extended hand. The closed door prevented the person from seeing. The waiting was never the wrong instinct. It was the right instinct that overextended past the moment where waiting was supposed to transition into responding. My beloved one, I need to permanently separate the validity of the waiting from the error of its duration. The waiting was valid. The posture of trusting God's timing and refusing to force outcomes before the outcomes are ready is a posture that honors the giver's sovereignty over when and how the gift arrives. The waiting honored me. The waiting demonstrated a faith whose patience exceeded what most people's patience could sustain. The waiting was worship, but worship that continues past the knock becomes a reason not to answer. My child, there is a moment in every season of waiting where the purpose of the waiting completes itself. The purpose was not to produce a permanent posture. The purpose was to prepare the recipient for the arrival, to build the specific, patience-forged, trust-established readiness that allows a person to receive what is being extended without the grasping energy that premature reaching would have produced. The readiness was the goal, and the readiness has been achieved. You are ready. The waiting accomplished what the waiting was designed to accomplish. The patience was built. The trust was established. The readiness was formed in the specific shape the receiving requires, and the shape is now fully developed, meaning the waiting's purpose has been fulfilled, and the continuing of the waiting, past the fulfillment of its purpose, is producing the paralysis the waiting was never intended to generate. My dear one, the transition point between waiting and responding was not dramatic. It was not a voice from heaven announcing the waiting is over, and now you must act. It was a knock, a simple, specific, available to hear knock on a door, whose other side holds a hand extended across a threshold with a gift that the waiting prepared the recipient to receive. The knock came. The waiting's purpose was achieved. The responding is what comes next. Your hand just moved, and the first millimeter of movement toward the threshold is producing a response in the extended hand that the season of stillness could never have generated. Because response requires movement, and stillness, by definition, produces none, my beloved child. Something shifted inside you within the last few minutes. Not a dramatic decision, a micro-movement. The specific, almost involuntary, leaning toward the door impulse that the theology of waiting has been overriding for months. Except this time the override did not activate. The leaning continued past the point where the pulling back usually intercepts it, and the continuation produced the first forward motion your body has made toward the threshold since the waiting began. 1 millimeter. And the millimeter changed the mechanics of the exchange. My dear one, I need you to understand what happens on the other side of the door when the person inside makes their first movement. The extended hand responds, not by moving closer. The hand is already at the threshold and cannot extend further without entering the house uninvited. By warming, the specific, circulation increasing, grip preparing warmth the hand produces when it senses that the responding hand is approaching. My hand just warmed because your movement was detected at the threshold. I have been preparing this moment behind every season of your faithful stillness. While you were holding the posture and sustaining the prayer and battling the suspicion that the other side of the door was empty, I was standing at the threshold, monitoring the distance between your hand and mine, tracking the leanings, registering each time the leaning was overridden by the pulling back, and waiting for the specific moment when the override would fail to activate, and the leaning would continue past the interception point. My child, the override just failed, not because it malfunctioned, because the impulse to respond finally exceeded the theology of waiting's ability to suppress it. And the exceeding is the transition. Type first millimeter if something shifted inside you right now, a leaning toward the threshold that the pulling back did not intercept, and the first forward movement your hand has made toward the extended hand produced a warming response on the other side of the door, because the God waiting at the threshold detected the approach, and the grip is being prepared. God is standing at your doorstep with a gift, but you have to open the door, and the title carries those specific words, because the exchange that has been waiting to complete requires the one action the viewer's posture has been preventing. My dear one, I need you to understand why the title says you have to, not you should, not you might want to consider. You have to. The language is not commanding. It is mechanical. The exchange is a two-sided gesture whose mechanics require movement from both parties. One side extended. That side is complete. The other side must reach. That side is pending. And pending is not optional in the mechanics of a gesture that cannot complete with one hand. A single hand cannot clasp itself. The mechanics require two. My beloved child, this is directly connected to the title and to the specific paralysis your theology of waiting has produced. The gift at the threshold cannot be placed inside the house by the giver. The giver arrived at the door. The giver knocked. The giver extended the hand. But the giver will not enter the house uninvited. Not because the giver lacks the authority, but because the gesture was designed as an exchange, and an exchange that is forced by one party ceases to be an exchange and becomes an imposition. I will not impose the gift. I will extend it, and extending requires receiving. My child, the theology of waiting that has been governing your posture interprets the waiting as the highest form of surrender. But surrender to a God who is holding a gift out across a threshold is not stillness. Surrender to a God at the door is opening the door. Because the God who knocked is not asking for more surrender. He is asking for the door to open so the gesture can complete and the gift can transfer from the hand that has been holding it to the hand that has been praying for it. The prayer and the gift are inches apart, separated only by a door and a hand that has not yet moved. Your hand is approaching the door handle right now, my beloved child, and the grip preparing warmth on the other side of the threshold is increasing. With every centimeter, your reaching hand closes between itself and the handle that opens the only barrier remaining between the giver and the receiver. I need you to feel the proximity of the clasp, not the spiritual concept of something eventually connecting. The present tense, hand on handle, fingers wrapping, door about to open proximity of a person who has been still for so long that the first deliberate movement toward the threshold feels like the most radical act their body has performed in months. The movement is radical, and the radical movement is the simple one. My dear one, everything has been building toward this handle. The seasons of waiting that prepared the readiness, the prayers that sustained the connection, while the posture prevented the completion, the suspicion that warped the wood of the waiting without breaking its surface, the leanings that were overridden by the pulling back, the millimeter that was not intercepted, the warming of the extended hand, and now the handle, the specific, physical, available to touch mechanism that converts the closed door between the giver and the receiver into an open threshold where the exchange can complete. The handle is within reach. Your fingers are approaching it. My child, turning the handle is not the dramatic faith-requiring, mountain-moving act your theology has been preparing you for. It is simpler than that. And the simplicity is what has been preventing the movement. Because a person who has been training for a dramatic act of faith does not recognize the simple act of reaching as the faith the moment requires. The faith required at this threshold is not dramatic. It is responsive. A hand reaching toward a handle that opens a door where a gift is being held by a God who already crossed every distance. The dramatic part was my arrival. The simple part is yours. Type reaching now if your hand is approaching the handle right now, and turning it is not the dramatic act of faith your theology trained you for, but the simple responsive movement that opens the only barrier between a God who already arrived and a person whose waiting just became a reaching. The door is open. Your hand is reaching across the threshold. And the fingers that have been still for months are making contact with the hand that has been extended across the doorway, since before your prayers began asking for the very thing it holds. My beloved child, this is the moment the two hands meet at the threshold, the moment the gesture that was incomplete, one hand extended, one hand still, becomes the clasp that completes the exchange the giver initiated, and the receiver has been too faithfully paralyzed to finish. The moment the gift transfers from the hand that carried it to the hand that was always meant to hold it. The clasp is happening. Right now, feel the contact. God is standing at your doorstep with a gift, and you just opened the door. The title said you have to open it. You opened it. The title said there was a gift. There is. And the gift is not sitting on the ground outside the door, waiting to be picked up at your convenience. It is in a hand, a living hand, extended across a threshold by a God whose posture at your doorstep has been the posture of a giver who will not impose what he carries, but will not withdraw it either. My child, the hand did not pull back when you opened the door. The hand was exactly where it has been since the extension began, steady, full, patient beyond any patience a human hand could sustain, holding what your prayers have been requesting in a grip that was never going to tire and was never going to release until the responding hand arrived to receive what the extended hand was always holding for it. The responding hand arrived, the clasp is made, and the gift is transferring from the giver's grip to the receiver's grip in the specific, weight-shifting, unmistakable sensation of something that was held on one side of the threshold now being held on the other. The gift is in your hands, and the exchange is complete. Now that the clasp is made, and the gift has transferred across the threshold, everything about the theology of waiting that governed your posture is being permanently restructured by the revelation that the waiting was complete long before you stopped waiting. My dear child, this is what happens when a person who believed their only assignment was stillness discovers that the giver completed his side of the exchange before the waiting began. The theology does not merely adjust, it transforms, because the theology was built on the assumption that the waiting was producing the conditions for the arrival, that each additional day of faithful stillness was bringing the giver one step closer to the threshold, and the discovery that the giver was already at the threshold before the first day of waiting began means every subsequent day of waiting was a day the exchange could have completed, but did not, because the person inside the house was being still when the moment required them to be responsive. The realization is not condemnation, it is liberation. My beloved child, the liberation is restructuring the relationship between your faith and your action. The old framework said faith waits and action presumes. The new framework, the one the clasp just installed, says faith responds. Not faith forces, not faith manufactures, faith responds. To a knock that already sounded, to a hand that is already extended, to a giver who already completed every movement on his side of the threshold and is simply waiting for the one corresponding movement that converts the faith from a posture into a clasp. Responsive faith is not presumptuous faith. Responsive faith is completed faith. The faith that was being held in the posture of waiting just completed itself through the act of reaching. And completed faith produces a different relationship with every future threshold than the waiting faith was capable of sustaining. The next door that carries a knock will not produce months of stillness. It will produce a reach. Type responsive faith if the clasp just restructured your theology. And faith that responds to a knock with a reach is not presumption but completion, converting the posture of waiting into the clasp that the giver's extended hand was always designed to receive from a person whose one missing movement was the only thing the exchange was waiting for. Let me show you what your life looks like now that the gift has transferred across the threshold and the clasp has converted your posture from waiting into receiving. Because a person who has learned to respond to the extended hand moves through the world at a pace the paralyzed version could never access, my dear one, the first thing that changes is the speed of the exchange cycle. You have been operating on a cycle that runs pray more, doubt, wait more, nearly give up, wait more. The cycle consumed months of your life per exchange, not because the giver was slow, because the receiver was still. And a still receiver in a cycle that requires responsive movement extends the duration of every exchange by the exact amount of time the receiver spends being still when the giver is already at the threshold. The cycle just compressed from months to moments, My beloved child, the mornings change permanently. You have been waking into the posture, the first conscious awareness of each day, reinstalling the waiting orientation that governed every hour. Tomorrow you wake into responsiveness. The first impulse the morning produces will be evaluated differently by a system that just learned the knock precedes the waiting, and the reaching follows the knock, and the gap between knock and reach is measured in the willingness to move, rather than the duration of the stillness. The mornings will carry movement, not paralysis. The gift now in your hands is producing immediate effects in the areas of your life that the waiting was keeping on hold. Every dimension that was suspended, not by God's timing but by the receiver's posture, while the gift sat in the extended hand waiting to be clasped, is now activating, not gradually. The way systems activate when the power supply they were waiting for finally connects. The connection just happened, and what was on hold is coming alive. People are going to notice the responsiveness before you explain the clasp. Because a person who has been faithfully paralyzed and suddenly begins moving carries an atmospheric shift that others register as something fundamentally different about the way that person interacts with what is being offered to them. My beloved child, the ones who watched you during the waiting season, who observed the posture, who sensed the faithful stillness, who perhaps admired your patience without recognizing that the patience had crossed into a paralysis that was preventing the exchange from completing. Those people are about to encounter the responsive version. They will say you seem ready. They will mean you started reaching. My child, there is a specific quality a person carries when they transition from waiting for life to happen to them into responding to what life is extending toward them. The quality is not aggression. It is not the manufacturing energy of a person who is forcing outcomes into existence. It is the specific clasp-informed, threshold-trained quality of a person who learned that the giver arrives before the receiver realizes, and that the appropriate response to an extended hand is not more prayer about the hand, but the movement that clasps it. The quality is availability. And available people attract what unavailable people repel. Connections that require availability to form are approaching your newly responsive frequency right now. There are opportunities, relationships, and divine appointments whose threshold has been extended toward you for longer than you suspect. Hands outstretched in your direction that the paralysis was preventing you from detecting. Because a person who is oriented toward stillness does not scan for extended hands. My dear one, scanning has begun. The responsive posture produces a detection radius the waiting posture could not generate. And what is being detected in the scan are thresholds that have been waiting for your reaching, the same way this threshold was. Type available now if you believe the transition from faithful paralysis to responsive faith is producing a detection radius that is revealing extended hands you could not see while the waiting posture was governing your orientation. And what is being detected are thresholds that have been waiting for your reaching, the way God's threshold was waiting for the clasp. I need you to understand why I chose to extend the hand rather than place the gift inside the house without requiring the door to open. My beloved child, because the method reveals something about the kind of relationship I designed between us that a gift placed without participation could never produce. I could have placed the gift inside your house while you slept, the way packages are left at a doorstep, the way blessings are sometimes deposited into a person's life without their conscious participation. The gift would have appeared in your living room one morning, present, real, undeniable. No door to open, no hand to clasp, no movement required from the recipient. I chose the hand instead of the package, because I wanted the clasp. My child, a gift placed without participation produces gratitude. A gift received through a clasp produces relationship. The difference is the contact. When a hand extends across a threshold and another hand reaches back, the two hands touch. And the touching is the point, not the gift. The gift is what the hand carries. The touch is what the gesture creates. I designed the exchange as a clasp because what I want with you is not a delivery service. It is a relationship whose every exchange involves contact between the giver and the receiver, hand to hand, presence to presence, threshold to threshold. My dear one, I chose you for the clasp method because the relationship I am building with you requires the specific participation level, hand-to-hand intimacy that passive receiving cannot produce. A recipient who receives without reaching is a recipient whose relationship with the giver is one-directional. A recipient who reaches is a participant in a two-directional exchange, whose contact point is the threshold where both hands meet. You were not given a doorstep delivery. You were given a hand, because the God who carried the gift wanted to touch the person he was giving it to. The doubt surfacing right now is asking the question the theology of waiting trained you to ask. What if reaching was the wrong movement, and the correct response to wait until the gift was placed inside the house without requiring me to open the door? My child, it sounds like this. What if I opened the door too early? What if the reaching was presumption disguised as responsiveness? What if the correct posture was more waiting, and the movement I just made was the impatience the waiting was designed to prevent, and the clasp I felt was my own hand, grasping rather than God's hand, being received? That doubt just applied the theology of paralysis to a moment that was never designed for paralysis, and the theology collapses under one observation. My beloved child, a knock is not ambiguous. A knock is the specific, unambiguous, door-level signal that the person on the other side has arrived and is requesting the door to be opened. A person who hears a knock and remains still is not exercising patience. They are refusing to answer, and the refusal to answer a knock is not the same spiritual posture as the patience that waits for the knock to arrive. Before the knock, patience is correct. After the knock, response is correct. And the theology that applies the before the knock posture to the after the knock moment is a theology that has confused the two seasons and is applying one season's instruction to another season's requirement. The knock came, the season changed, and the reaching was not presumption. It was the only appropriate response to a God whose knock means open, and whose extended hand means reach, and whose presence at the threshold means the waiting's purpose has been fulfilled, and the responding has begun. You did not move too early. You moved at the knock, and the knock was my signal that stillness was finished and responding had started. Type at the knock if the doubt just accused the reaching of being premature, and you now understand that patience before the knock and response after the knock are two different seasons, and the theology of waiting that applied the before the knock posture to the after the knock moment was confusing the two seasons, rather than correctly identifying that the knock changed the assignment from stillness to responsiveness. During every month the door was closed, I was not approaching from a distance that the waiting was supposed to shorten. I was on the doorstep, hand extended, knuckles having already knocked, standing in the specific posture of a giver who completed every movement on his side of the threshold and was holding the position for as long as the person inside needed before the reaching began. My beloved child, you imagined a God who was en route, whose arrival at the threshold was pending, whose distance from the door was being reduced by each day of your faithful waiting, as though the waiting itself was pulling the giver closer to the threshold at a rate proportional to the patience being invested. I was never en route during your waiting season. I was already there. My child, the en route assumption is what the theology of waiting runs on. The assumption says, if I wait faithfully enough, long enough, patiently enough, the giver will arrive. And the assumption produces a logical framework where each additional day of waiting is an investment that reduces the remaining distance between the giver and the door. But the distance was zero from the beginning of the waiting. Every day of waiting that your system invested was a day invested in closing a distance that was already closed. The giver was at the threshold. The hand was extended. The knock had sounded. And the person inside, faithful, patient, sincere, was investing in the reduction of a distance that did not exist, while the giver on the other side was holding a posture whose patience exceeded any human patience, because the giver's patience does not deplete the way the receiver's does. My dear one, I was never going to withdraw the hand. Not after 1 month of closed door. Not after 12. Not after a duration that exceeded what any reasonable giver would sustain. The hand was going to remain extended until the door opened, because the gift was addressed to you, and the giver does not withdraw what was addressed. I know the exact night the suspicion that no one was on the other side of the door reached its deepest point, my dear one, and I know it because my hand was pressed against the door at that exact moment, and the warmth of my palm was the only thing preventing the wood from becoming cold enough for the person inside to conclude the threshold was permanently empty. There was a night, the specific night where the accumulation of unanswered knocks, not unanswered by me, but unresponded to by you, produced the floor-level moment where the suspicion crossed from wondering into near certainty that the doorstep was vacant. Near certainty that the posture of waiting was aimed at an empty threshold. Near certainty that the faithfulness was being poured into a direction that held nothing. My beloved child, I felt the near certainty through the door. The way a hand pressed against wood feels the temperature change on the other side. The near certainty cooled your side of the door, and the cooling traveled through the grain of the wood toward my palm on the other side. I pressed harder, not to force the door open, to transfer warmth through the wood. The warmth you felt that night, the inexplicable, sourceless, middle of the near certainty warmth that arrived in the coldest moment without traceable origin. That was my palm, pressed against the door, transferring the specific heat that a hand pressed against a surface for an extended period naturally produces into the wood that was separating my side from yours. My child, you felt the warmth and could not explain it. The near certainty could not account for warmth, arriving at the moment of maximum cold. And the unaccountable warmth is what prevented the near certainty from becoming full certainty. Because full certainty that the doorstep is empty does not produce warmth. And warmth was present. Type warmth through wood. If God just described the specific night, the suspicion reached its deepest point, and the inexplicable warmth that arrived without traceable source was the giver's palm, pressed against the other side of the door, transferring heat through the wood to prevent the near certainty of absence from becoming the full certainty that would have ended the waiting before the reaching could begin. Now that the door is open, and the clasp is made, and the gift has transferred across the threshold, there is one thing I need you to do, my beloved child, and it is the instruction that converts this single exchange into the permanent posture the remaining thresholds of your life require. Keep the door open, not leave it open recklessly, unguarded, undiscerning, available to anything that approaches the threshold. Keep it open to the knock, the specific, God-identified, giver-initiated knock that your spirit learned to recognize during this exchange. The knock carries a frequency. The frequency is identifiable. And a person who has experienced one complete exchange, one full cycle of knock, open, reach, clasp, receive, now carries the frequency recognition that allows them to identify the next knock when it arrives. My child, the theology of waiting will attempt to reinstall itself the moment the current exchange settles. The system that governed your posture for months will interpret the settling as a signal to resume the default position. Door closed, posture still, orientation shifted from responsive back to waiting. The system will present the reinstallation as wisdom, as the return to the faithful baseline the waiting season established. The reinstallation is not wisdom, it is regression. The baseline just changed. The faithful baseline is no longer stillness. The faithful baseline is responsiveness. And a responsive baseline does not close the door between exchanges and return to the center of the room where the praying happens without the reaching. A responsive baseline keeps the door openable, the handle accessible, the reaching muscles warm, so that the next knock, which is coming, and coming sooner than the first one came, because the responsive posture detects, knocks faster than the waiting posture does not require months of overcoming the paralysis before the hand moves toward the handle. Keep the door open. Keep the hand ready. And let the reaching become the reflex the waiting used to be. You made it to the clasp, my beloved child, and I need you to stand at the open threshold long enough to feel what it means to hold a gift that was transferred from a hand that was extended across your doorway before you knew anyone was there. Feel the clasp, not the gift alone, the clasp, the specific, hand-to-hand, threshold crossing, two-sided gesture completing contact between the giver who traveled every distance and the receiver whose one movement closed the final inch. The gift is in your hands, but the contact is in your memory, and the contact is what changes the posture permanently. The contact changes everything the waiting could not. I want to thank you for something the paralysis made almost impossible to sustain. Thank you for the leanings, the brief, almost involuntary, spirit-driven impulses toward the door that the theology of waiting kept intercepting before they could produce the reach the threshold was waiting for. Each leaning was a signal that the responsive part of you was alive beneath the waiting part. And the alive part is what eventually produced the millimeter that became the reach, that became the clasp. My dear child, thank you for the warmth you felt through the wood on the night, the near certainty almost won. Thank you for not converting the near certainty into full certainty. Thank you for the fraction of doubt you maintained about the absence, the small, fragile, barely surviving possibility that someone was on the other side of the door despite the months of silence, because that fraction of doubt is what kept the door openable on the night the leaning was not intercepted. Let the tears come, not waiting tears, not paralysis tears, clasp tears, the tears of a person whose hand just made contact with the hand of a God who was standing at their threshold the entire time, holding what they were praying for in a grip that was never going to tire and never going to withdraw, and was always going to be there the moment the door opened. Type clasp tears if tears are forming right now, because your hand just made contact with the extended hand of a God who was at the threshold before the prayer began. And the contact between the giver, who crossed every distance, and the receiver whose single movement closed the final inch, is the most intimate exchange your faith has ever completed. You are not the person waiting behind the closed door anymore, my beloved child. That identity, the one whose theology of waiting produced a faithfulness that crossed into paralysis, the one who prayed about a gift that was already being held out across their threshold, the one whose leanings toward the door were intercepted by a pulling back that classified responsiveness as presumption, the one who stood in the center of a room, oriented toward a door, whose other side they suspected was empty, while a God with an extended hand was pressing warmth through the wood to prevent suspicion from becoming the certainty that would have made the reaching impossible. That identity was completed out of existence the moment the door opened, and the hand reached, and the clasp was made, and the gift transferred from the giver's grip to the receiver's grip across a threshold that was always designed to be crossed by both parties. You are the person who reached, and reaching changes everything waiting could not. The theology of paralysis that governed your posture, your prayer life, your orientation toward every threshold, and your relationship between your faith and your action has been permanently replaced by the theology of responsiveness. Not a theology of forcing, not a theology of manufacturing, a theology of completing, the specific clasp-informed, threshold-trained understanding that God arrives before the receiver knows, and knocks before the prayer begins, and extends before the reaching starts, and that the only assignment the receiver carries is the one movement that converts the extended hand into a completed exchange. My dear child, the movement was always yours to make, and you made it. From this moment forward, you carry the identity of a person whose God extends and whose response is to reach. Not a person who waits behind closed doors while the giver stands outside, holding what the prayers are requesting. A person who hears the knock, opens the door, and completes the clasp. Because the clasp is where the gift transfers and the contact is made, and the relationship that the gesture was always designed to produce comes alive at the threshold where both hands meet. The door is open, the clasp is made, the gift is in your hands. And the God who was standing at your doorstep before the waiting began is now standing inside the threshold. Because the door that opened for the gift also opened for the giver. And the giver does not leave after the exchange. The giver enters. The hand that extended the gift is now the hand that is holding yours, not releasing, not withdrawing to the other side of the threshold now that the transfer is complete. Holding, because the clasp was never about the gift. The clasp was about the contact, and the contact is not a transaction that completes and releases. It is a connection that clasps and remains. Walk through the rest of your life with a hand clasped around the hand that crossed every distance to reach your threshold. My beloved child, the gift is yours. The contact is yours. And the God whose hand was extended across your doorway, since before the first prayer, is now holding the hand that finally reached back. And the holding will not release, because the giver who waited for the clasp will never let go of the hand that finally made the movement the threshold was always waiting for. Subscribe to this channel so that every time God extends a hand across your threshold, the knock reaches you before the theology of waiting convinces you to remain still behind a door whose other side already has a giver standing at it. You are not someone who waits behind closed doors anymore. You are someone who hears the knock and reaches. The next message carries the first gift report from a person whose clasp just changed their posture permanently, and what is being held in the hand that finally reached will prove that the giver was always at the doorstep, and the only thing ever missing was the single responding movement that converted the waiting into receiving. Type door open if you are leaving this message permanently changed. Knowing God was at the threshold before the prayer, the hand was extended before the waiting, the knock came before the stillness, the warmth through the wood was his palm, and the God whose hand you just clasped across the threshold is the same God who will never withdraw what he extends, and will never let go of the hand that finally reached back to complete what was always designed to be a two-sided gesture between a giver who crosses every distance and a receiver whose one movement closes the final inch.